Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Wendy. It's so great to see all of you here. We have two wonderful nursing presentations in this section that both relate to trauma in various patient populations. So if you would join me in welcoming our first group who's presenting on experiences of trauma among the unhoused, Elliot Yoder, Josh Stuckey, Leah Beachy, and Marianne Short.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming to our presentation. My name is Joshua, and these are my colleagues, Elliot, Marianne, and Leah. Today, we'd like to engage in conversation with you about experiences of trauma amongst unhoused populations. Our time at EMU, specifically our intercultural experiences in Guatemala, Cuba, and Europe, have made us passionate about addressing inequalities and injustice on both individual and systemic levels. The Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, or STAR, training we received in Guatemala and Cuba made us increasingly aware of ways in which trauma, often stemming from systems that we create and exist in, can have long-term negative consequences. It is not soon that I will forget the family living in a house no bigger than this stage, only in such a situation because of the US bombs that they fled during the Guatemalan Civil War.
Our world is rife with inequality and health disparities. Guided by Hirschberger and colleagues' Sacred Covenant Framework for Nursing approaches of justice, partnership, and advocacy, we are empowered as nurses and public health officials to confront justice and inequality wherever and whenever we can. Trauma that leads to homelessness and the trauma of homelessness are among these inequalities. According to Susie and colleagues, in 2024, approximately 771,480 people were experiencing homelessness in the United States, almost a 20% increase from the previous year. Despite the prevalence of homelessness in the US, it can sometimes feel like a distant issue. Yet, as nurses and healthcare professionals, many of us will interact with this population regularly, often serving as a primary point of contact within the healthcare system.
Before we continue, it is important to establish a shared understanding of a few key terms. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration defines trauma as resulting from events or circumstances, experiences being physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that have lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and well-being. Homelessness is defined not only as living on the streets or in shelters, but also as staying in motels, hotels, or campgrounds, couch surfing, or staying with friends or family.
In this presentation, we'll explore different sources of trauma experienced by the unhoused population, detailing how the bidirectional relationship between homelessness and trauma impacts their ability to survive and thrive. These sources of trauma include adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, traumagenic systems, and the experience of homelessness itself. We'll also explore nursing implications and potential evidence-based solutions as we seek to interrupt the cycle of trauma and homelessness. Throughout the presentation, we'll also engage you in a few small activities to keep you awake, get your blood flowing, and help illustrate the complexity of trauma and homelessness.
To understand the relationship between trauma and homelessness, we begin in childhood, within the context of social determinants of health. The World Health Organization defines social determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, including housing, education, and access to healthcare. These conditions are strongly associated with health inequities, with lower socioeconomic status consistently linked to poorer health outcomes across the lifespan. This broader structural context is important because social determinants of health do not just shape access to resources, but also influence early exposure to conditions that affect development and health trajectories. One example of this is adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, ACEs are defined as potentially traumatic events occurring before the age of 18, including abuse, neglect, and household dysfunctions, such as parental mental illness, substance use, incarceration, or domestic violence exposure. Importantly, while ACEs occur across all populations, Walsh and colleagues found that they are significantly prevalent among children of low socioeconomic status, highlighting how social determinants of health actively shape early trauma exposure.
Because ACEs occur during such a critical developmental period, understanding their impact on the brain is crucial. Research demonstrates that as ACE exposure increases, so too does the likelihood of both neurodevelopmental and mental health disorders, reflecting a clear dose-response relationship. For example, a study by Seema and colleagues found that higher ACE exposure is associated with increased risk and severity of developmental and psychiatric conditions. Similarly, Liu and colleagues demonstrated a graded relationship between ACE exposure and mental health outcomes, with higher ACE scores linked to more severe psychiatric symptoms and a greater prevalence of mental illness. In addition, Murphy and colleagues explained that chronic early life stress associated with ACEs can disrupt brain architecture and dysregulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis, resulting in altered cortisol secretion and maladaptive stress response patterns. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child describes this prolonged activation of stress response systems as toxic stress. Toxic stress disrupts brain development, particularly in regions responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and decision-making, and can also have lasting impacts on overall health and well-being.
When we look across the research, there's consistent evidence of a strong dose-response relationship between ACE exposure and housing instability. In other words, as ACEs go up, so too does the risk of homelessness. Children with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences have over 45 times the odds of experiencing homelessness compared to those with none, as shown by Chipalo and Odi. Supporting this, Liu and colleagues found that over half of individuals experiencing homelessness report 4 or more ACEs. Importantly, this relationship is not unidirectional. It is a bidirectional, self-reinforcing cycle. While ACEs increase vulnerability to homelessness, homelessness itself also increases exposure to further adversity. Children experiencing housing instability are more likely to encounter additional ACEs, including caregiver stress, parental mental illness, substance use, and disrupted schooling, as well as unsafe environments. As Leah mentioned earlier, ACEs shape long-term vulnerability by disrupting stress regulation systems and neurodevelopment. Over time, this leads to higher rates of mental illness, substance use, and engagement in high-risk behaviors, as well as lower educational attainment and reduced employment opportunities. According to Liu and colleagues, these compounding effects create significant barriers to exiting homelessness, reinforcing the cycle over time.
Overall, the literature supports the relationship between ACEs and homelessness as a bidirectional, self-perpetuating cycle shaped by social determinants of health and systemic inequalities. To illustrate how early life conditions can influence functioning, we will now take part in a short activity. Most of us are familiar with head, shoulders, knees, and toes. We are going to play this game, but with different levels of constraint to represent how early adversity can affect functioning. If your name begins with A through I, so think of the first letter of your name, you will play as normal. If your name begins with J to R, you may use only one hand, but still must touch all of your body parts, so both joints. If your name begins with S to Z, you may only use one hand and must pause for 3 seconds between one repetition to stimulate increased cognitive and physical load. We will do this for 20 seconds while I play some music. And the goal is to complete as many repetitions as possible, so move fast, you don't have to follow along with the song. No need to do eyes, ears, mouth, and nose, and when the music stops, we will return to the presentation and compare your numbers of repetitions with those around you. So go ahead and stand up.
Should we do it too? We should do it too.
Alrighty, and you all may begin. Ready, set, go. Head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. Head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. Eyes and ears and mouth and nose. Head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. Alrighty, stop. Everybody stop. Alrighty. Randomly, shout out how many repetitions did you guys get?
2?
Yeah, so we've got some big variation here, right? Because of the different constraints you had. So head, shoulders, knees, and toes takes a lot more brain power, energy, and time when you are facing barriers, and so too does living with significant childhood trauma. This was a simple illustration of how early life constraints can shape functional capacity over time. Everyone was doing the same task, but not under the same conditions.
In addition to trauma experienced in childhood, unhoused populations often deal with trauma induced by the systems they interact with. Examples include the foster care, criminal, justice, welfare, and healthcare systems. In many cases, gaps and failures within these systems contribute directly to the acquisition of trauma. This is perhaps most clearly illustrated by the foster care system. Research from the Power to Soar Foundation suggests that approximately 40% of children in foster care experience some sort of abuse. As individuals age out of the foster care system, which itself is often a traumatic transition, they are ideally expected to move into adulthood stably. However, research by Merhol and colleagues shows that individuals who have aged out of the foster care system are disproportionately represented among young people experiencing homelessness. This disparity is shaped in part by structural barriers, including limited access to the private rental market, related to skepticism because of the finances of those who've aged out of the system. In addition, the lack of strong transitional programs for youth exiting foster care leaves many without adequate support, increasing the frequency with which they fall through the gaps between these systems.
Homeless populations in contact with the criminal justice system also tend to be predisposed to worse outcomes. According to Jacobs and colleagues, individuals released from prison into an emergency shelter have a 30% higher chance of rearrest than those released into more permanent housing. Additionally, they found that when the size of a given homeless population decreases, the recidivism rate, or the rate at which people recommit crimes and are rearrested, also declines. Together, these findings suggest that stable housing reduces criminal justice involvement and repeat offenses, ultimately helping to interrupt and break the cycle of homelessness. Overall, this highlights how the criminal justice and housing systems are deeply interconnected in ways that are often overlooked.
Welfare systems, which are designed to help individuals in need, can unfortunately sometimes create unintended harm through the way they are designed. In our work with recently rehoused individuals, we learned that they are unable to save up more than $2,000 without losing benefits. Most of these individuals were disabled, putting them in an impossible situation. The gap between $2,000 in the bank, hardly enough to be considered a safety net, and the amount needed to pay for groceries, rent, utility, transportation, and all of the other costs that come with life is massive. This parameter essentially incentivizes people to stay jobless, unhoused, and in poverty. Perhaps the system that is most important for us as nurses and public health officials to look at is the healthcare system. Research by Tang and colleagues shows that unhoused individuals often receive substandard care and are more likely to be dismissed or treated differently within healthcare settings. In addition, Berzosa highlights that unhoused populations frequently experience mistrust towards medical professionals, especially Black women.
These past few examples are an excellent demonstration of systems theory, especially the first principle of systems theory, which says that all elements of a system affect each other. Let me tell you a quick story about a man within systems trying to find equilibrium. A friend of ours recently spent some time in DC working with homeless men. There he met a man who had been scraping by. He had a house and a job, but one day had the misfortune of stepping on some glass and cutting his foot. Given the choice between healthcare and housing, he chose housing, until his foot became so badly infected that he had to choose healthcare, which in turn caused a significant financial burden, leading to a loss of housing. In stories like these, it quickly becomes clear how disparities in income affect healthcare and housing, and how so many people are just one misstep, literally, away from homelessness. These systems are inextricably intertwined. It's easy to say that he should have just found a better job, or cheaper housing, or not even stepped on glass, and hard to confront the truth that while wages for the top 0.1% have increased 1,003% since 1979, wages for the bottom 20% have only gone up 132%, and that there is a shortage of 3.6 million homes for those with extremely low income. Furthermore, unhoused and low-income individuals are often treated differently when they do seek health care, notwithstanding the times they don't, due to an inability to pay. As nurses, we are called to confront these hard truths.
All right, now for another activity. In this scenario, you all need health care. Perhaps you stepped on some glass, fell, or the pain you've been having for a while has gotten out of hand. You will all have 30 seconds to come up to the front and have your handout signed by us, and if you don't have a handout, we can just shake your hand. But if you didn't make it to 7 repetitions of head, shoulders, knees, and toes, you must continue in the same manner you were before you can come up and get health care. Yeah, so 30 seconds, move quickly,
Any
ready,
questions?
set, go. All right, everyone needs to move back to your seat. There's no more health care for today. Sorry, Wendy, we live in a broken world.
Alrighty, can you raise your hand if you got health care? Yes. Alrighty, so I see a lot of people in the front couple rows here with health care. Who didn't make it out of their seat? Okay. And a lot of the S to Z names I would guess. So while perhaps lacking in some nuance, this is a rudimentary way to illustrate a harsh reality. Your life circumstances, represented by where you decided to sit today, and the ACEs you carry, both significantly impacted your ability to navigate systems and acquire the services you need to survive and thrive.
Before we move on, can the people who got a red dot before the presentation raise your hand? If you got a red dot, those with your hands raised, I'm going to ask you to come to the front and stand on the stage to the right of Leah. You represent the experience of being homeless, and your exposure up front represents the lack of shelter, privacy, and comfort integral to the experience of being homeless. We will address you all in a bit, so you can just stay where you are. When we talk about homelessness, we often focus on its causes. However, what is sometimes overlooked is that homelessness itself is not just a condition, but a chronic and cumulative traumatic experience. Conceptualizing homelessness as trauma is essential to understanding why exiting homelessness is often so difficult, even when services are available. Through a meta-analysis, Goldschmidt and colleagues identified 2 primary forms of homeless-related trauma. First, they described the initial loss of housing, which is associated with a decline in mental health. The experience is often internalized as an individual failure to age well, rather than being understood as a consequence of structural factors such as lack of affordable housing or systemic flaws mentioned earlier.
This concept of failing to age well is not harmless. It is often internalized and leads to deep feelings of shame, worsening one's mental health status, and further compounding vulnerabilities and barriers to seeking help and recovery. The second form of trauma, identified by Goldsmith and colleagues, pertains to feeling abandoned and forgotten by society. This overlaps considerably with our discussion of systemic sources of trauma. Across their review, participants frequently reported being let down by the systems that were supposed to provide support, such as shelters, healthcare systems, and social services. This repeated pattern of systemic failure, such as when shelters are unsafe, reinforces a perception of societal abandonment and otherness, contributing to a cycle of reduced trust in services and a decreased likelihood of seeking help in the future. Importantly, This evidence suggests that homelessness is not a single traumatic event, but a repeated and cumulative exposure to trauma over time. A qualitative systematic review by Adams and colleagues synthesized findings from over 900 individuals experiencing homelessness and learned that trauma during homelessness is continuous and interconnected, with participants describing persistent feelings of shame, isolation, detachment, and helplessness.
These feelings and experiences were further reinforced through ongoing instability, unsafe environments, and repeated exposure to adverse events. The review also identified that many individuals experiencing homelessness live in a state of constant fear related to threats to personal safety, exposure to violence, and uncertainty about meeting basic needs such as shelter and food. This state of hypervigilance and sustained psychological stress is consistent with trauma-related responses. Additionally, the cumulative nature of trauma during homelessness contributes to progressive deterioration in mental health over time. In the same systematic review mentioned by Elliot, Adams and colleagues found that repeated exposure to traumatic events was associated with worsening outcomes, including anxiety, depression, and substance abuse.
Even spaces designated for unhoused individuals to take shelter can be sources of trauma. Individuals frequently describe shelters as unsafe, reporting experiences of humiliation, depersonalization, and loss of control. Day-to-day survival, as Josh just mentioned, also exposes individuals to ongoing traumatic stressors. Research by Goldschmidt and colleagues shows that a large percentage of people experiencing homelessness, anywhere from between 27 to 87%, have experienced violence or sexual assault, with the situation being particularly severe for women. According to the Safe Alliance, more than 90% of women who are homeless have experienced severe sexual or physical abuse. Goldschmidt and colleagues also stated that those with mental health and physical health issues are much more likely to be taken advantage of or targeted for crimes. As a result, many individuals report feeling a need to maintain a state of hypervigilance, feeling unsafe in both public spaces and shelters. This ongoing stress is further compounded by frequent theft of essential items, including medications, accessibility devices, and documents, further complicating obtaining access to healthcare and services.
In response to these cumulative stressors, individuals adopt a range of coping strategies. Adams and colleagues found that while some responses are adaptive, many are maladaptive, such as turning to substance use, self-harm, or emotional withdrawal, which can further worsen both physical and mental health outcomes. Emotional withdrawal can include resignation or normalization of trauma, marking a loss in hope critical for existing in homelessness. Collectively, the evidence demonstrates that homelessness is not only an outcome of trauma, but an active driver of it. Through continual exposure to stress, systemic failures, and unsafe environments, homelessness creates a self-perpetuating cycle that makes regaining stability incredibly difficult. So let's bring our attention back to our homeless friends in the front. Again, this is an extremely simple visual representation of homelessness as an isolating and traumatic experience. But do you have any comments for your experience up here?
Well, I didn't have a choice, and it did feel awkward to stand up here and listen to you talking about us, and maybe also brought up uncomfortable feelings.
I think you will. You all may be housed.
Taken together, the evidence shows that trauma and homelessness exist in a self-reinforcing cycle, one that is shaped both by early experiences and ongoing systemic barriers. This raises an important question. If trauma is cumulative and ongoing, how do we begin to intervene? To close, we'll turn to evidence-based nursing and public health approaches that aim to interrupt this cycle. One of the most important frameworks guiding this work is trauma-informed care. According to Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma-informed care involves recognizing the widespread impact of trauma, actively working to prevent re-traumatization, and promoting safety, trust, and empowerment. As identified by Goldschmidt and colleagues, These principles are especially relevant among individuals experiencing homelessness, where trust in healthcare and social systems is often low. 3 major systematic reviews and meta-analyses by Debishok, Clarare, Edgar, and their colleagues suggest that trauma-informed approaches are linked to improved psychological outcomes, reduced substance use, and increased engagement with services. While findings vary across settings, the overall trend in the literature supports meaningful benefit.
Trauma-informed care is strengthened when paired with early identification of trauma exposure, according to the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. ACE screenings implemented into well-child checks and other healthcare encounters allow providers to identify those at higher risk for toxic stress and long-term health consequences, and offer appropriate evidence-based interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy. It is pertinent to note that the CDC emphasizes that screenings alone do not improve outcomes unless paired with appropriate interventions and resources. As explored in a study by Austin and colleagues, supportive relationships and resources can help rebuild coping mechanisms and improve emotional regulation over time. Despite trauma, disruption of brain development, and stress response, the brain is capable of adaptation and recovery with proper support and treatment. Identifying trauma through screening and responding with evidence-based, trauma-informed interventions allows healthcare providers to actively support recovery and improve long-term outcomes.
In practice, trauma-informed care shapes how care is delivered, particularly through therapeutic communication and relationship building. It is especially important in high-contact settings such as emergency departments, community clinics, and outreach programs. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association, effective trauma-informed care is rooted in 6 core principles of safety, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural humility. In practice, this includes offering choice, avoiding judgmental language, and prioritizing trust over compliance.
For those familiar with EMU's nursing program, there is a clear connection between trauma-informed care and the Sacred Covenant framework, which emphasizes partnership, presence, justice, and advocacy. Both approaches encourage us to view patients as active partners in care and to ground our practice in respect and relational trust. Beyond communication, trauma-informed care also informs intervention design. Systematic reviews, such as one conducted by O'Leary and colleagues, indicate that trauma-informed psychosocial interventions, including counseling, case management, and peer support, are associated with improvements in mental health, substance use, and housing stability. While these improvements may be modest, they are consistent and clinically meaningful.
To address these structural factors, system-level interventions are necessary. One of the most well-supported approaches in the literature is the Housing First model. Housing First provides immediate access to stable housing without requiring sobriety or treatment compliance. This differs from traditional treatment-first models, which require individuals to achieve stability before being eligible for housing, an expectation that may be unrealistic given the psychological and biological effects of trauma. Peng and colleagues conducted a systematic review of 26 studies and found that Housing First programs decreased homelessness by 88% and improved housing stability by 41% compared to Treatment First programs. Improvements in mental and physical health, substance abuse, and quality of life were also observed. By significantly reducing chronic stress, exposure to violence, and uncertainty, stable housing creates the conditions necessary for trauma-informed and recovery-oriented interventions to be more effective. Despite strong evidence, implementation remains limited due to barriers such as insufficient affordable housing, funding constraints, and fragmented service systems. However, the literature demonstrates potential long-term financial benefit. In a systematic review conducted in 2022, Jacob and colleagues projected that for every dollar invested in Housing First programs, $1.44 would be saved by society, with reductions of cost in emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and incarceration, which would offset initial costs.
Despite growing evidence, important gaps remain in the literature. There is significant variability in how trauma-informed care is defined and implemented, which makes it difficult to identify a standardized model. Additionally, much of the research is short-term with limited data on sustained outcomes over time. Certain populations are also underrepresented in existing research, including racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals, rural populations, and older adults. These groups often face unique and compounded forms of trauma that are not adequately captured in current studies. Together, these gaps highlight the need for more consistent, long-term, and inclusive research to guide practice. At the community level, organizations play a critical role in bridging systemic gaps. As shown by Edgar and colleagues, community-based programs and peer support models improve engagement, trust, and resilience by providing social connection and continuity in relationships.
One example of a community-based organization is Our Community Place here in Harrisonburg, which operates using principles aligned with both trauma-informed care and housing-first models. In addition to providing basic resources, they support individuals in maintaining housing and navigating barriers that would otherwise lead to relapse and homelessness. The four of us spent a semester designing and facilitating a support group for the recently rehoused program. We structured weekly sessions around a skill that our participants were interested in developing, such as budgeting or meal preparation, and became a community that was a source of stability and friendship for all involved.
Ultimately, while trauma and homelessness cannot be fully eliminated, the evidence clearly shows that its impacts can be meaningfully reduced. Addressing this issue requires attention to both individual experiences and the broader conditions that shape them. A combined approach of trauma-informed care at the clinical and program level, alongside housing first and other structural interventions at the systems level, offers a strong evidence-based path forward. This work also connects directly to our ethical responsibility as nurses. The Sacred Covenant framework calls us to uphold dignity, justice, and advocacy, not only in our individual patient interactions, but also in how we engage with the systems that influence health outcomes. Policy is a critical part of this. Expanding access to affordable housing, increasing trauma-informed training for everyone as well as healthcare professionals, and improving coordination between healthcare and social services are all evidence-supported strategies that can reduce harm and improve outcomes.
As nurses and public health officials, our role is not to solve homelessness alone, but to act as informed and compassionate contributors within larger systems. This means combining clinical skill with critical thinking and advocacy, and recognizing that meaningful change requires both upstream and downstream approaches. At the same time, these solutions are not limited to healthcare professionals. Whether as nurses, students, or community members, we all have a role to play. Through advocacy, awareness, and community engagement, we can contribute to systems that are more responsive, more equitable, and more effective. By integrating trauma-informed care, evidence-based interventions, and system-level change, we can help reduce the impact of trauma and support pathways towards stability, recovery, and healing.
We would now like to open up the floor to audience questions.
I can take that.
I have a microphone so that people who are online can hear your questions, so raise your hand if you've got one.
Most of us are really clueless about all of this, but I would be interested in hearing more about what it was like for all of you to be in the community setting that Elliot mentioned briefly.
Personally, it felt definitely a little bit uncomfortable to step into originally, just because I haven't been exposed or surrounded by the homeless population, people who are recently housed very much. And so when we first attended a meeting, all of the people were new there. We hadn't met them before. And it was really cool to see that how as the meetings progressed, the weeks progressed, we got to know the individuals more. And it was really cool to see the bonds that we formed and the trust that we had among each other. And although I don't understand this population 100%, I feel like I have a much better understanding of them, not only of their circumstances, but just, of them as people and who they are.
Yeah, one regret I have in this presentation is that we didn't include a lot of conversation about resilience factors that a lot of the homeless population has. And that is something that I really appreciated about our support group, is that we got to know individuals really well and see their resiliency and their personality traits that maybe helped them navigate a little bit better, and the way that they just persevered through a lot of tough situations and continued to laugh. It was a lot of fun, yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, Leah, I liked your comment about resilience. I was wondering if any of you could comment more about the difference you see between resilience exhibited in recently housed individuals and the resources that are available to them, and how you might be able to integrate that idea into your future career as healthcare and public health professionals.
That's a doozy. Can you repeat the question? That was a multi-parter.
I'm just interested in your thoughts on the difference between resilience and as an intrinsic personal factor and the resources available to someone. How that shapes the conversations you have with people.
Yeah, so I think sort of to pivot back to ACEs almost, the ACEs make it really hard to have a lot of those resilience factors sometimes. And with resources, I think it was pretty evident within the group that we hosted, the recently housed group. It was really evident how having housing and having access to the other resources that our community place provides, like they help you schedule your CSB appointments and like know the rules and regulations for how much money you're supposed to have or can have to keep receiving benefits. It's very clear that with that help, they're far more resilient. Like it sort of to piggyback off of what Leah was saying earlier, it was really cool to see how different individuals had different strengths and then contribute to the group in that way. Like we had one group member who was really great at managing the little money that she had. And it was really cool to be like, so what do you think about, like on the day that we did budgeting, it was like, what do you think about this? And what are the things that you do to stay like up on your finances? And so it's pretty, at least within our group, it was very clear that having access to those resources made it easier to be resilient than if you didn't have access to those resources. I don't know if that answers your question.
Great presentation. You hear so much about burnout in healthcare, and it seems like so many healthcare professionals and public health officials are just stretched so thin. I'm curious, you said that this framework trauma-informed care has been really emphasized in your education at EMU, and I'm just curious how you've seen that actually, through clinical, do you see healthcare professionals actually actively, how have you seen this carried out, and if you haven't, or if you would want to see that more, what do you think that hospital systems or, hospital administration can do to make it easier for nurses and other healthcare people to care about this stuff? Does that?
Yeah.
There's, an internal struggle between having to do all of your nursing tasks to keep your patients physiologically healthy and then addressing their psychosocial needs. And at EMU, we're really taught to integrate the two, which is really helpful, but there's always that time constraint that really prevents, ideally, how much you could be supporting your patients. One solution that is always thrown out is reducing the nurse-patient ratio so you have more time with your patients at the bedside to talk to them and provide trauma-informed care, but that costs money, and hospitals don't like that. What else? There's very specific sectors of nursing, like SANE nursing, which is a sexual assault nurse examiner, that probably has their own specific set of trauma-informed principles, as well as community health nurses that are going into the community and doing well-child checks or mother-baby checks. They would have their own sets of training, hopefully, but overall, it would just be good to maybe have that more emphasized in bedside and ED nursing specifically is what I've noticed, but I don't know.
I might just add, as a nursing faculty, Really, really good trauma-informed care is care that's integrated wherever you are, kind of like when we think about, designing a sidewalk specifically so that someone in a wheelchair can have access. It actually helps everybody, right? It helps somebody who's temporarily on crutches or a mother or parent who's pushing a stroller. So trauma-informed care is the same, like universal design is the same idea, right? If we have that approach just integrated in, we are careful about the questions that we ask or the assumptions maybe that we make. It doesn't have to be, it can take more time, but it doesn't have to, and it can be just a way to approach all care. Because, we never know when we're interacting with people who have experienced trauma. Other questions?
I was wondering, I know not all of you are nursing students, but having had this experience this semester, if you were, you don't all need to answer this, but if you were to be caring for a patient, a client who was unhoused, and you're caring for whatever ailment they came in with, what are one or two questions that you might ask that person in relation to their social situation?
I think starting by just asking about their experience. I think we're often really scared to ask questions and tend to tiptoe around sensitive issues like that. And I think often people are way more willing to talk about these things than we would anticipate as people who haven't experienced or often haven't experienced those things. And so I think just being pretty open and upfront and being like, it says here on your chart that you are unhoused. Like, can you tell me a little bit about that experience? I think that is not a harmful question and one that they are pretty willing to answer. We had an opportunity a couple weeks ago to talk with one of the people in our group one-on-one and ask her questions like that, and she was very willing to share. And I think that's an outlet that those people don't often have. So that's one question. Somebody else can have a second one.
Well, yeah, that's in our evidence-based practice class. We learn, or we kind of talked a bit about when we had a guest speaker, that you can't really ask if they have access to certain things if you don't have the ability to provide the resources for them to then receive those things, because then you're just asking with no solution. So ideally, we'd be able to be like, do you have access to food? And then if not, provide them with resources for that. But that's not quite how the system, we have gaps in our systems that prevent that from being entirely feasible. So my ideal answer to that question is different from probably my real answer to that question, which like Josh said, similarly, it's providing presence and just support in the ways that I can.
I probably would ask a question related to barriers to attending follow-up appointments or going and getting medications, just because that's a really important part of their healing process. And if they don't have a way to get to any of those things, that's going to set them back even more than the point where they started. And like Leo was saying, I would want to make sure that if they don't have transportation, I would have some options that I could provide to them. But yeah.
I'm not a nurse, but
You're like half a nurse.
by this point, I'm half a nurse, yeah. But I guess as a future public health official, really working on those system level changes is super important. Making sure that trauma-informed care is integrated into them. And so, I don't know, my focus, I want to focus on kind of small community health type of things. So just kind of getting the bearings of what the community I'm in has. Asking about are you able to access these social services, or how's your experience working with this program, and kind of seeing what I can do maybe as someone in the community with maybe a little more leeway, or not leeway, a little more power. No, that's not right. Just seeing what I can do to help talk to these programs and systems, and yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. 5-minute turnaround, so nursing students, you know what to do, and the next group will be ready to go at about 10 till.
Am I gonna hear
Oh, this is
myself,
like all the way on the
echoing?
ground.
If it's too loud in the room, I'll turn it down.
Okay, like I can step away.
I use the arrows to switch sides, right?
I'll put them up here in just a minute.
Oh, there's a video we have to click on too on one of them, but it's on the slide.
All you have to do is
It, I don't want to do that.
get after it.
Megan? This thing is like
Hello.
right here and I don't like it.
Testing.
Thank you. Okay.
Dang, y'all are busted. Huh?
Do I have time to go use the bathroom?
We don't have to be up here right now.
Yeah. No. Alright,
Yeah.
you guys can just I don't know.
That's what I'm afraid of. If I sit down to use the bathroom.
I would just
I don't know if it's...
I just
What do you say? I need to pee. Okay, let's go over here and do a prayer circle. I need to stop a prayer circle. If I just yell, I think I'll feel fine after.
All right, as we start to transition, nursing students, please sign in to this next presentation. All right, we are ready to have our second in this series of presentations on various types of trauma. This group is presenting on Breaking the Silence, Stigmatization of Sexual Violence Survivors. And our presenters are Emily Suarez Nunez, Jackie Jackson, April Stafford, and Megan Kiger. Let's welcome them to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan, and I'm here today with my fellow classmates,
April, Emily,
Jackie.
and today we will be discussing the stigmatization of sexual violence survivors. Before we begin, I want you to acknowledge that this presentation addresses the topic of sexual violence, and some of the content may be distressing. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, please know that it's okay to step away or take a break. We also want to note that throughout the presentation, we will be using the terms victim and survivor interchangeably. First, I'd like you to take a moment and imagine something. Imagine experiencing a deeply personal and violating trauma and feeling like you cannot tell anyone about it. Imagine the fear of being blamed, judged, or not believed. This is the reality for countless survivors of sexual violence. Sorry. The World Health Organization defines, quote, sexual violence as any act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, or an act directed against other persons using coercion. Any person, regardless of their relationship to the victim, this can occur in any setting and affects individuals across all ages, genders, and backgrounds, end quote. The reality of this is sobering. Studies from the CDC show that nearly half of women and 1 in 6 men experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime, yet the majority never report it. Why? Because society often places the burden of blame on the survivors rather than the perpetrators. This is what we call stigma. Stigma is more than just a feeling of shame. It's a set of negative beliefs, social judgments, and assumptions about survivors. It tells them implicitly or explicitly that the assault was somehow their fault and that their experiences are less valid, or that speaking up will bring more harm than help, and the consequences are real. Stigma prevents survivors from seeking help, it worsens mental health outcomes, and it limits access to care, leaving people to navigate this trauma on their own. Before we dive further, I want to engage you for a moment. Think about this. In 1 to 2 words, why do you think survivors might hesitate to seek help? And then I'll give you a minute to respond. So just scan the QR code. So I see judgment, fear, shame, being judged, which all play a role. These are exactly the barriers that keep the survivors in silence and prevent them from accessing support, treatment, or justice. And this isn't just an individual problem, it's a public health and societal issue. When survivors don't get care, the trauma doesn't go away, and it can lead to long-term mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even substance use. Families, communities, and healthcare systems all feel the ripple effects from this. This is where nurses and healthcare providers have a crucial role. We are often the first line of support for survivors. Through trauma-informed care, active listening, and evidence-based interventions, we can create environments where survivors feel safe, validated, and empowered to seek help. But to do that, we first need to understand the impacts of stigma and the barriers to care, which is exactly what we'll be exploring today. Our discussion will focus on 3 key points. 1, identifying barriers. both social and systemic, that survivors face when reporting sexual violence. 2, understanding stigma, how societal attitudes prevent disclosures and access to care. And 3, examine mental health effects, how survivors are affected more than just physically. By the end of this session, our goal is for all of us to have a clear understanding of the silence that survivors face and how we can collectively work to break that silence, challenge stigma, and create a supportive environment for healing. So, as we move into the main portion of today's presentation, I want you to carry this thought with you. Silence is not strength, but support is. Every survivor deserves to be heard, believed, and supported, and it starts with awareness, understanding, and a compassionate action.
Before we dive into barriers to sexual violence reporting, we first need to define what we mean by sexual violence disclosure and reporting. Sexual violence disclosure is the act of a victim telling their story to a healthcare professional, law enforcement officer, or support person to seek help. This does not require a formal police report or evidence collection or even medical care. Sexual violence reporting, on the other hand, includes submitting an official police report and going through the evidence collection process. Now, these concepts can raise legal and ethical dilemmas for nurses who are listening to survivors' disclosures. It is important to note that in the state of Virginia, registered nurses are mandated reporters of child and elder abuse. This means, as a nurse, if you receive a disclosure that involves child or elder abuse, you must report it. This is not the case for adult disclosures unless they involve the endangerment of these vulnerable populations. Now that we have defined what disclosure and reporting will mean for this presentation, we are going to look into the internal and societal barriers victims face when reporting sexual violence. Take a moment to think, if you were a victim of sexual violence, what would be a barrier to your reporting the crime to law enforcement? I'll give you a few minutes to respond. Okay. Yes, these are all good responses, especially the one of being unaware of the process. There are many barriers to victims reporting these crimes, and we are going to discuss a few as you see up here today. According to a study conducted by Downing and colleagues, victims who sought sexual violence care within 32 hours of the initial event were more likely to report the crime to law enforcement than those who sought care after the first 32 hours. Victims who delayed care often reported that they felt that it was too late to report the crime or feared not being believed due to the delay in reporting. The same study also identified that those same victims who had consumed alcohol before the event were less likely to report the violence to law enforcement. Some factors associated with this were identified as fear of persecution from the law if underage drinking and fear of blame due to inebriation at the time of the violence. According to a similar study conducted by Lovell and colleagues, victims noted the lack of trained forensic health professionals was also a factor in their decision not to report to law enforcement, as well as the examination kits being confusing, disempowering, and burdensome. This study shows that with untrained professionals performing care, the victims are not receiving the proper information regarding reporting or the examination process. This limits the victim's ability to make informed decisions regarding their care and the desire in regards to reporting the crime. As we will discuss later, stigma plays a large role in the effectiveness of the recovery process for sexual violence survivors. A study by Jukes and colleagues identified that higher levels of stigma were associated with a lower likelihood of reporting the violence to formal authorities, such as law enforcement. Instead, these victims chose to seek informal sources of information and care. For these victims, the stigma felt influenced the way they sought care and their decision-making process in reporting this crime, which in turn increased the likelihood they would have adverse mental health and physical outcomes long-term. Now that we have gone over what barriers these survivors face in reporting these crimes, we will discuss briefly the interventions we as nurses can do to help alleviate some of these barriers. One intervention we can implement on the department level is to employ more forensic trained nurses. Forensic nurses are specially trained in sexual assault examination, evidence collection, and care. Ensuring more emergency departments across our nation have these specially trained nurses on staff will help reduce the amount of incorrect information and non-trauma informed care they receive. Now we will invite you all to watch a video of real survivors telling their experiences of care with forensic trained nurses. I invite you to reflect on what you learned and experienced in this video. These survivors' real-life experiences reinforce the need for properly trained forensic nurses in emergency departments across our nation. Our next intervention we would like to discuss is access to resources. We are aware that not all emergency rooms may have access to forensic nurses as they take time and money to train, but every department can have better access to survivor resources for these vulnerable patients. In our local area, we are fortunate to have an advocacy center that specializes in caring for these victims called the Collins Center. Over the course of the semester, our group partnered with this agency to help update education materials for their clients in regards to the forensic exam process. Throughout the crowd, we are having a few people disperse some of the pamphlets we created for the Collins Center. I invite you to share with each other, pass around, and imagine being a survivor who was full of fears and questions about what to do next. Think of some of the questions you would have about your care and see if they can be answered in our pamphlet. These education materials outline the examination process and the patient's rights during the exam to ensure that they are receiving all of the required information to make informed decisions about their care when they arrive at the hospital. We also wanted to ensure that the pamphlets explained what an advocate from the Collins Center can do for them initially and throughout their journey to recovery. These pamphlets will be distributed by the advocates upon their initial contact with the victim, as well as being available to patients who seek care at our local emergency department at Centera and Augusta Health's emergency department. Access to education materials like the ones we created this semester, as well as the advocacy services, are crucial in ensuring these victims feel heard and understand the reporting process and their rights in deciding what course of action we as nurses take in caring for them.
Societal stigma surrounding sexual violence affects victims' experiences and recovery in a multitude of ways. The factors that we will be discussing today include culture, gender nonconformity, and socioeconomic status gathered from across multiple different studies. Think about your own culture and society. What societal and or personal stigmas would you face as a victim of sexual violence? This is the last Mentimeter, y'all. I'm sorry.
No, it's not. There's one more.
Second to last. I think a majority of people have already responded, so I would like to take a moment and ask, is there anyone who would like to elaborate on the answer that they gave? Anyone else? If not, then let's move on. Thank you for taking the time to share, and I appreciate and recognize all of your responses. Reckenberg and colleagues' study discusses the impact of gender on the perception of individuals who have experienced sexual or physical violence in childhood. Stigma was assessed through an examination of readiness to address specific traumas and conversation and attitudes towards people in these incidents. This study included about 600 persons from Germany, 50% identifying as female, and of those respondents, 38% indicated that they are more likely to address trauma with female victims and survivors than with their male counterparts. Additionally, 49% of respondents stated contact with male victims and survivors was more likely avoided than contact with female ones. These findings indicate greater stigma shown towards male victims and survivors of sexual violence than their female counterparts. Males had a greater tendency to stigmatize, especially towards their same-sex peers. Socially established gender roles may act as a basis for different communication traditions and the notion that victim-perpetrator viewpoints where males are not envisioned as victims. Another study done by Brandstrom and colleagues examined how structural stigma at the country level affects experiences among individuals across gender, gender nonconformity, and socioeconomic status. This study included about 86,000 sexual minority adults living among 28 European countries, all whom were victims of sexual assault or threats of violence. Most participants self-identified as gay or lesbian, 84%, and as a man, 74%. Researchers found that individuals living in countries with higher structural stigma were more likely to experience victimization versus those living in countries with lower structural stigma. These results suggest that the widely recognized risk of victimization against sexual minority individuals is heightened in countries with higher structural stigma, and that stress experiences of sexual minority individuals are determined by their broader structural environment. As nurses, there are many interventions we can implement to reduce societal stigma. The use of respectful language allows victims to feel seen, heard, and understood. Reminding people that they have autonomy allows them to choose their next steps and remember their right for care. Showing compassion is our duty as nurses to provide as much support as possible for individuals during any type of traumatic experience. And it is up to nurses to challenge societal stigma and reduce bias to allow for the betterment of any community. Every day, nurses support each other to fulfill their ethical obligations to patients and the public. According to the American Nurses Association Nursing Code of Ethics, Provision 1 states, quote, "The nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person," end quote. Nurses must engage in personal reflection to identify their bias or prejudice that may interfere with or harm the nurse-patient relationship. We need to acknowledge that biases can be conscious or unconscious, and that elements such as culture, value systems, religious and/or spiritual beliefs, lifestyle, social support system, preferred language, and sexual identity play a substantial role in care. Provision 3 states, quote, "The nurse establishes a trusting relationship and advocates for the rights, health, and safety of the recipients of nursing care," end quote. Nurses must recognize that anyone who is considering their options for care should be free from unnecessary influence and encouraged to make decisions that are in line with their values and beliefs. We ought to build trust through relational consent and partner with individuals to determine agreement or refusal in every care encounter. Provision 8 states, quote, "Nurses build collaborative relationships and networks with nurses, other healthcare and non-healthcare disciplines, and the public to achieve greater ends," end quote. Nurses must bring awareness to human rights violations. Abuse, sexual assault, oppression, and all other violations are of serious concern to nurses. We must engage in discernment, carefully assess intentions, reflectively weigh all potential options, and compose clear moral justifications for actions. Ultimately, nurses are ethically responsible to provide the highest quality care, which begins with recognizing and addressing our own personal stigmas. As we have learned so far, barriers are affected by societal stigma, which in turn will affect the victim's mental health outcomes as well.
Now to turn on to the mental health side. Sexual assault is often solely correlated with the physical impacts it has on the victims. We also want to shine light on the impact it has on their mental health as well. Physical traumas may heal and leave a visible scar. However, mental health effects aren't visible to the public, and therefore we need to put in additional effort to look for and care for the scars some may have regarding their mental health. I will ask you all to now get back into the role of a nurse in an emergency room, caring for a patient who was a victim of an episode of sexual violence. By scanning this QR code, please tell me in a few words what possible effects on the patient's mental health would you be observing? Very well. The biggest words I see are anxiety, depression, disassociation, withdrawal. Those are all things that we can expect we would see as ER nurses when taking care of a patient who has been assaulted. Negative psychological outcomes that were identified after a sexual violence occurrence include self-blame, stigma, and barriers to self-compassion. Noel Strickland and colleagues performed a qualitative research study in 2021 on a group of 8 Canadian women who experienced sexual assault. Some of the participants in that study noted that stigma regarding sexual assaults were often seen through social media outlets and then reinforced by the opinions of their friends and their families. Negative self-image, disclosure concerns, and concerns about public attitudes were 3 characteristics that were identified by Emily Mellon and Mark Hatz-Buehler in 2023 when they conducted a longitudinal study. They stated, quote, "Our results indicated that sexual violence stigma is associated with symptoms of generalized anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder," end quote. Now we will apply Aguilera's crisis theory onto this. It is when a person is in a state of equilibrium and then a stressful event occurs, which leaves them in a state of disequilibrium. Attempts at coping are initiated but unsuccessful. Then, increased tensions continue to build up and disorganization is felt. Equilibrium restoration is the goal, and in order to get there, 3 balancing factors are required. They are as follows: realistic perception of event, adequate situational support, and adequate coping mechanisms for a resolution to occur and equilibrium to be reached once again. Without one or more of these balancing factors, no resolution can occur and disequilibrium is maintained. When a victim is first seeking care, they are at the peak of crisis and disequilibrium. However, they are taking the steps to get back to equilibrium by looking to get care. After the initial examination, the lack of balancing factors can have a long-lasting effect on their mental health. How that is addressed may determine the length they remain in a state of crisis and disequilibrium. This is why nurses who have trauma-informed care backgrounds are so crucial when providing care for victims of sexual assault or violence. How a victim perceives the care they are receiving at the time of crisis will influence the drive they have to pursue further care once they have crested the climax of the crisis. Additionally, as nurses, we can empower the victims to choose what levels of care they want to receive and then advocate for them if their needs are not being met. For example, when the victim is having a physical evidence recovery kit, commonly known as a PERC exam, done, as nurses, we can speak up, ensuring that their mental health is also being cared for. Nurses can also help the victims have access to support persons whose presence can help calm the victim and bring support that is solely focused on them. Bart and colleagues in 2023 performed a quantitative cross-sectional study where an increase in reporting and improved outcomes were noted when a support person was present for the victim at the time of examination. Overall, as nurses, we can provide warm spaces for victims to feel safe, not judged, provide clear information in a way that is easy for them to understand, and empower them to have full control in all aspects of their care. Lastly, nurses can provide adequate resources for the victim to access beyond the initial examination.
As we move towards the end of our discussion, it is important to recognize that while the research on sexual violence has expanded over time, there are still significant gaps that limit how effectively we can support survivors. First, many studies lack diversity in the populations. Researchers often focus on specific groups, which means experiences of individuals from different racial, cultural, or socioeconomic backgrounds are not always fully represented. Second, there's a lack of longitudinal studies. Much of the research captures only a single moment in time, rather than showing how trauma and stigma affect survivors over the course of their lives. Cultural differences are also understudied. Beliefs, social norms, and stigma surrounding sexual violence can vary widely. Yet, research does not always reflect these differences. Additionally, male and LGBTQ+ survivors are often underrepresented. This lack of inclusion can reinforce stigma and make it more difficult to develop support systems that meet everyone's needs. And another limitation is that many studies rely heavily on self-reporting. While this type of data is valuable, It can sometimes be influenced by memory, fear, and hesitation to disclose.
Because of these gaps, there is a clear need for more inclusive, diverse, and long-term research moving forward. One potential way to address some of the gaps in research is through research on trauma-informed care. For example, a study could examine the impact of trauma-informed care training on survivor outcomes. This could involve comparing hospitals or healthcare settings that have enhanced their trauma-informed training to those who have not. The study could measure outcomes such as reporting rates of sexual violence, patient satisfaction, and mental health outcomes like anxiety, depression, or PTSD symptoms. The goal of the research would be to better understand whether improved training for healthcare providers can reduce stigma and encourage survivors to help seek help and report their experiences.
To conclude, sexual violence survivors face significant barriers that are deeply rooted in stigma, societal attitudes, and gaps within the healthcare system. These barriers often prevent survivors from speaking out, seeking care, and receiving the support that they need. Throughout this presentation, we have discussed how stigma contributes to the silence, how it impacts mental health, and how both social and systemic barriers limit access to care. So what can we do now? As future nurses and as people, we have the power to make a difference. We can practice trauma-informed care by creating safe and non-judgmental environments. We can listen actively and validate survivors' experiences. We can challenge harmful stereotypes and victim-blaming attitudes. And we can advocate for better research, training, and access to care. Change doesn't always start on a large scale. It starts with us in our everyday interactions. Every time we choose empathy, understanding, and compassion, we help break down stigma and create a space for healing. I want to leave you with this final thought. Silence protects stigma, but awareness and compassion can create change.
We want to acknowledge the heaviness that this presentation might have brought to us all, and therefore we want to engage you all in taking a series of deep breaths to recenter ourselves as we open for your questions. So please have both feet flat on the floor, close your eyes, and take a deep breath in through your nose. 2, 3, 4. Hold it. 2, 3, 4. Exhale through your mouth. 3, 4. Hold it. 2, 3, 4. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. Alrighty, you guys can resume breathing normally. Thank you all for listening.
Questions you have for this group? Is that an actual arm raise, or were you getting bumped?
So after learning all this and working with the Collins Center, what's one takeaway you have that you will implement in your own nursing practice?
I think for myself is providing compassion and ensuring that when patients are around me, they feel safe and warm, and that I am an open ear for them and can always provide resources.
Maybe along with that, are any of you thinking about becoming forensic nurses ever?
Maybe in the future, especially after this presentation, I think I have always been really attracted to the idea of having one-on-one care with people. And so this seems like a type of nursing job that I would like.
Was there anything that surprised you when learning about forensic nursing?
I think just that they do more than just sexual assault. They do a lot of strangulations and other traumas. What else? What's the other one?
Any domestic violence, stuff like that. It doesn't have to be violence in a sexual nature for the forensic nurse to help to care for that patient. They're actually going away from calling them SANE nurses, so sexual assault nurse examiners, to forensic examiners, because their scope is widening to all of those different patients as well.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I really appreciate all of the information about how to support survivors of violence and sexual violence as nurses through that process of disclosing and reporting and through the examination. One thing I fear, my perception is that a lot of the things that cause apprehension are valid, that we do have a society that, as you stated, for which there is a lot of stigma, and a lot of the things that we put on the board have played out in real life for many survivors. So I'm wondering beyond, and so the victims or the survivors, they're not the problem. The problem is society and the violence that was inflicted upon them. I was wondering if you have any ideas about particular settings or populations for whom it would be helpful to also be educated, just maybe as kind of a drop in the ocean, add a drop to the ocean of decreasing the stigma and decreasing the current reality and risks of reporting in our culture and society.
Yeah, I think something that I was also thinking about when trying to figure out what topic to think about, and we were trying to figure out what our presentation for colloquium was focusing on college students. Collins Center does work in partnership a lot with James Madison University. They do events, educational events is what you're referring to. So I think that specifically within Harrisonburg, in this city, a focus would be greatly towards the university students and the college students. And if you want to get even more specific, the freshmen as they come in fall, because that kind of is kind of the rise. The freshmen are here for the first time. Maybe they're away from home. They're learning how to be adults and this thing called college and what you do there. And unfortunately, that is where a lot of the assaults do occur. So I would focus on educating the college campuses and also the high school campuses around this area as they begin their transition from adolescence into young adults.
Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause.
We have one more nursing presentation here in about 15 minutes, but we're at the end of a session. So if you want engage points for the session, in 15 minutes go back and hang out with Laura, sign that QR code to get your EMU engage points as well as signing out, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.